Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon.
Well, welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and it's just been too long, but always a delight when we have the time to get together with Laurie Cardoza-Moore. She's the founder and the president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and you can go to pjtn.org. That is her website. There's a picture of the landing page, and of course, you see her program also here on the Dove Television Network. We're honored to carry it. She's all over the place. Laurie, good to see you. How are you, friend?
Hey, I'm doing good, Perry. Thank you for having me back on the show.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're like one of us.
I know, and there's a lot to discuss.
So what's happening, Israel? It's been in the news, but it really hasn't been in the news. What's going on over there?
Well, the biggest concern right now is what's going on with Iran and the fact that 6 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars are going to go to fund the Iranian regime. And we know that that money is not going to go toward humanitarian aid. In fact, it's my understanding, I haven't checked this morning, but the people that the money was being provided for, it put them in a holding house, but they've not been released. Although maybe this morning they're going to be released, but we gave over 6 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund this initiative. And of course, the prime minister was crying foul about this, that this is going to hurt Israel, it's going to hurt America. But we have a regime in place that is continuing the Obama's agenda. And it's very frustrating. As Americans, our tax dollars are not being spent in a wise manner. We're actually going to fund Israel's enemies. And,
so
what do we do with it? I mean, it's not like we can stop paying our taxes and say, do a better job.
Yeah. So basically what this is, we're waiting to see the release, but basically this is a lifting of previous sanctions, correct?
That's correct. And of course, the previous sanctions, like the sanctions before that we dealt with, nothing is going to change in Iran. We're basically going to be beholden to the Iranian regime. And until we change, this is why, Perry, the 2024 elections are so critically important. And we as Christians have got to show up at the voting booth. We have got to get rid of these people. They do not represent our values. They are hurting our allies around the world, especially our relationship with the state of Israel. Bibi Netanyahu knows that he has the support of the American people. But, he's got to deal with this administration, which unfortunately we have to live with.
Any idea, Laurie, how this policy and the lifting of these sanctions will impact the Abraham Accord?
Well, I don't think it's going to really impact anything. There's what the administration hoped that they could achieve in trying to move the ball down the court, if you will, to try to get not just the Abraham Accords policies, but other policies passed. Of course, it's going to put pressure on Israel because Israel, of course, if they start expanding their territory and they start building in some of these areas, our country is going to condemn the building. And we've already seen that here recently, where there was condemnation because there was expansion in one of the areas of Israel. This was Israeli territory. And our government butts in and says, stop doing that.
Because
I don't know how the Abraham Accords are going to do any better. I do believe that the Saudis are probably working behind the scenes with the Israeli government, and they're doing their own negotiations aside from what Biden is doing.
That's where I was going to go, because at the end of the day, by us lifting the sanctions against Iran, This heightens the friction between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and that could bring Saudi Arabia into the camp, so to speak, to work with Israel on airspace access if need be.
Exactly. Nope, absolutely right. And so we just sit back and we watch. We know that Bibi's got this covered, and he's going to do what's going to be in the best interest for the state of Israel, and we stand with him for making that decision.
All right, a couple things on the Prime Minister. First of all, have you had an update on his health? And then how is this judicial reform going?
Yeah, well, so his health, as far as I can tell, you know, watching him publicly speaking, it's like he didn't even miss a beat. And so
kind of like you.
Where I get that energy from my Israeli brethren. Yeah. So he seems to be doing very well, thank God. With regards to the whole judicial reform issue that's going on, you know, looking at what just happened here in the United States with President Trump and the constant attacks, we see the same thing happening to the Prime Minister of Israel. And, you know, like I said earlier, Israel knows that we, the people, have their back. We support them completely in all of their efforts and what they're trying to do to try to have some judicial reform. Because the problem, we have to remember, the same problems that we're watching happen unfold in Israel with these judicial reforms, and the reason why the people are rising up is for the same reason that we are here in America. A little bit different situation, but it's basically the same thing. We're dealing with a bunch of judges who think that they can go in and they can change the policies. I mean, look at how they're taking our Constitution and our laws and using them against a previous sitting president. So no, we're facing very similar issues in both of our countries, and we shouldn't be surprised because, of course, America and Israel, we all know that God has a special plan for both of our nations in these last days. And so we're going to see the same attacks against President Trump and against the Prime Minister of Israel. You're going to see similar because the same people were fighting the same people. Because they're trying to push the same agendas in both countries.
Yeah. What seems interesting to me, and I realize being the Prime Minister, you're the tip of the spear, but I think what we don't hear is the majority of the Knesset is for these reforms, and yet you never see them dragged into the news. It's only Netanyahu.
No, of course not. It's just like what we see, the political bias here in the United States. It's the same thing. And so we just have to continue to stand and support, let Israel know, you know, we've got Israel's back. We support them. We support the judicial reform. We understand that, you know, just like they have a voice, they have their Knesset, their legislative branch. And when the people of Israel speak, they want to make sure that their values are represented. They don't want judges coming in and saying, we're going to change that. We have a different perspective of how we view that issue. And that therein lies the problem. So I think we're going to, you know, God willing, we're going to see a constitution come out of this eventually in the state of Israel because they don't have a working constitution. So I think, and I think a lot of it is influenced because of America and because of the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. I mean, Bibi grew up in America. He went to school in America. And so we see some of when we hear him speak, you know, he speaks our language. You know, that's why Americans love this Prime Minister, because when he speaks, we can relate to what he's saying, because he speaks like, even though he's an Israeli, he also speaks like an American.
Yeah.
American with faith.
He has backed away from the judicial reform. He's letting it calm down, which is good. I would imagine now with all of the interest back over to Iran, that's kind of preempting things. I don't know how long he's going to let this calm down, but it's not going to go away. Where do you think it is in the process at the moment?
No, I think everybody is, because we are hearing some of the rumblings. There's still protests that are going on, and those protests are going to continue to go on because the people who are trying to block him in this effort for reform are not going to stop. Just like we see what's happening again in the United States. I draw the comparison because I want Americans to understand, especially American Christians, to connect the dots to what's happening in Israel with what's happening here in the United States of America.
Yeah, well said. In the meantime, around the world and in America, there's a continued rise of anti-Semitism, and I know that you're a hawk on this, but it's still growing. What's behind this?
There's several things, Perry, but to kind of keep it short and sweet, we have a growing number of anti-Semitic incidents that are occurring now, even within the Christian world. And this is unfortunate. We've seen it with mainline Christianity, but we're starting to see a growing movement of this anti-Semitism. And I think it's coming from a couple of areas. Number one, you have patriots who are being misled into thinking that Israel is the problem. They're listening to the lies. And I see this when I speak to some of these patriot groups. At the very end, when I open up for Q&A to these patriot groups who are Christians, they start challenging this and they start communicating the same narrative as what we heard with the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. These are lies and disinformation that are perpetrated, blood libels against the Jews, and have been against the Jews for several hundred years. Of course, anti-Semitism goes all the way back to Egypt. So it's an ancient hatred that never goes away. The sad reality, Perry, is that Christians should know better. And the only way we can know better is if we read our Bibles. We have to become students of the Bible. The other problem that we're having with anti-Semitism is we're seeing a growing movement among young people. And I believe the reason why we're seeing it among young people is because it can be directly attributed to what we're seeing in their curriculum, what they're being taught in their textbooks, the bias against Israel. Israel is a usurper, that they're taking Palestinian land. This is being taught in the history books. This is being taught like in the ethnic studies model curriculum that we've been dealing with in California for the last 5 years. Now we see this ethnic studies model curriculum manifesting itself in curriculum or textbooks across the country. We knew this was going to happen. We knew in California on the West Coast, that's where most of the garbage comes into the classroom, because whatever gets passed or adopted in California eventually finds its way into America's classrooms. And that's why, Perry, PJTN, we have been on top of this issue with education. Yeah. We found an anti-Semitic quote that legitimized Palestinians blowing themselves up in a Jerusalem restaurant because they were waging a war against Israeli government policies and army actions. We found that a decade ago. And back then, you remember, we were sounding the alarm, telling people, parents and citizens, you better look in your kids' textbooks, because this propaganda, this hatred is being communicated to our kids, and our kids are going to turn on our country. Because not only were we finding anti-Semitic content against Israel and against the Jews, but we were also finding anti-American, anti-Judeo-Christian, the values that our nation was founded upon. And that's why a lot of the work that we're doing now at PJTN right now, Perry, you know that I serve on the Tennessee Textbook Commission and on the Tennessee Social Studies and Civic Standards Commission. Mm-hmm. We are actually in the process of reviewing the social studies and civic standards in Tennessee. And of course, we're seeing some of the nuance, these comments in the standards. And had a meeting yesterday, and I reminded everybody, we passed a law in Tennessee that there will be no critical race theory taught in the school system. So we have to make sure that it doesn't filter into the standards.
Good stuff. All right, let me take a quick break. PJTN, Pacific Justice, Proclaiming Justice to the Nations.org. There we go. Proclaiming Justice to the Nation.org. PJTN.org. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. Always a delight to have with us Lori Cardozo-Moore. She's the founder and the president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations. And you can go to PJTN. That's her website. There's a picture there. And, of course, her program is here on the Dove Television Network. We're so honored to carry it. Lori, I want to come back to something you said earlier as it relates to the growing anti-Semitism in the United States and the comment that you made that even within Christendom, there seems to be a rise of anti-Semitism, and which is so amazing to me. As I examine this, it seems that there's a group, there may be some kind of Christian theology out there. Maybe it comes from replacement theology, where they feel like the Jew is not God's chosen, and the nation of Israel is just a nation. But this is growing. This is growing, and I am really concerned about it, because one thing is the Bible's pretty clear about Israel, especially in the Old Testament. But the other part of it is that it rubs against one of the Christian principles. Can you really hate somebody?
Well, unfortunately, Perry, when it comes to Jesus and the Messiah and what the Jews have been blamed for throughout history of killing Jesus, putting him on the cross, because of that, it's that mentality that causes such great hatred. You know, the Lord has, there's a great scripture that I like to refer to, that it comes out of a book of a prophet that very few Christians are familiar with in the Old Testament. And therein lies the problem, because a lot of Christians do not read the Old Testament scriptures. And the reason why they don't read the Old Testament scriptures is because they say those are old. They're no longer relevant. But as we teach in our Bible study every week, the New Testament can't stand on its own. The New Testament came out of somewhere. It started in the Old Testament scriptures, the prophets, the writings in the Torah. And unfortunately, when you are taught that because of replacement theology, because of supersessionism, remember where the church supersedes the call of God on the Jews and on Israel, because that replacement, it's no longer relevant. We don't have to study the Old Testament. We don't have to even read what the prophets foretold. But in the book of Obadiah, there's a great verse, and several verses. It's one book. It's a very easy read. I think 21 verses total in the one chapter. But it talks about what God is going to do to the nation of Edom, the descendants of Esau, in the last days. He said he was going to wipe out the descendants of Edom because they stood by while their brother Jacob, Israel, was held in captivity, and they did nothing. If we look throughout Christian history and we look how Christians stood by during the pogroms, during the Inquisition, during the Holocaust, and by and large, standing by again today, with what's not just what's happening in Israel, but even what's happening here in the United States, even with the rise of anti-Semitism. And this is important for us. There is also a prophecy Isaiah talked about as a prophet. He was saying in the last days, and this is in Isaiah 11, that Judah and Ephraim would unite together against the enemies of Israel. So we have this prophecy about what God's going to do to Edom and to wipe them out in the last days because they stood by. But then you have in Isaiah the two coming together, Jews and Christians together to unite against the enemies of Israel. Because after all, Perry, we as Christians are grafted into the commonwealth of Israel. We are grafted into the nation of Israel because of our faith in Yeshua, because of our faith in Jesus Christ. And because of that, we become part of the commonwealth. Even Paul talked about it in the book of Ephesus, about those people that with the Ephesians, those who were in Christ are Abraham's seed, and they are heirs according to the promise. What promise? The same promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was an eternal covenant, an eternal promise that he would keep. And unfortunately, we read those verses and it goes right over our heads. And this is why we're teaching this Bible study every week, trying to get Christians acclimated to understand their Hebrew roots connectedness.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm just wondering why replacement theology has grown, and obviously it's coming out of even some of the seminaries, and you kind of go, whoa.
Yeah.
Your head's on tilt with this stuff. I want to switch your attention because I know you track all kinds of things, and that is the persecution of the Jews of Portugal. What's going on?
Well, last year there was an incident that occurred. You know, I think you probably know, Perry, and for the listeners, so they know, Spain and Portugal over the last several years have been reaching out to the descendants of those who were persecuted during the Inquisition. And they wanted to make this right because of what happened in 500 years ago. And so they opened up and said, you know, as a country, we're going to allow those who can prove that they are descendants of the conversos, or they called them the Marranos, who were forcibly converted or forced to flee. Their families were forced to flee because of the Spanish Inquisition. And that's why we're doing this upcoming documentary, because a lot of Christians don't even know about the Inquisition. They don't know what the Spanish, what the king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, did in Spain, and how the church was behind it and has been behind it. But when this happened a couple of years ago and they opened up, there was an accusation against a local rabbi in a synagogue that he was selling certificates of individuals who were wanting to become dual citizens. They were certificates for dual citizenship for Spain and Portugal, but specifically for Portugal. There was a false accusation against a rabbi, and the rabbi was actually recently, this was a couple of years ago, arrested and falsely accused. His passport was taken away. It reminded me when I started reading about this account of what had happened even during the Inquisition and what they did to the Jews back then. And here we have all these Jews who made a lot of businesses, Jewish companies, moved their headquarters to Portugal because they were descendants, like my family are descendants of those who were forced to convert during the Inquisition. Now, there's a lot of research being done there. In fact, the Israeli government, this is one of the most important issues, finding these Jews who were forcibly converted, over time lost their identity. There's a great story of a woman when we put out our article. A Jewish woman reached out to me, sent me an account of what happened to her when she was in Toledo, Spain, and how a nun was taking her on a tour of a synagogue that had been converted to a church. It used to be a synagogue years ago. And the nun was explaining the history behind it. And this gal asked the nun, how can you say that these people were converted when they were forced against their will to convert to a faith that wasn't their own? And the nun smiled with a mocking smile. And she said, well, back then, at first, they converted to hide their Jewish identity. But over the centuries, over time, the Jews lost their identity. And she thought that that was funny. She thought that was a smart move on the Catholic Church, that they were able to force these Jews into forgetting who they are. And so the documentary film that we are working on producing, and you can find more information at the website, Perry, but the documentary that we're working on producing is to help those Jews find their way home. This is the other half of Judah. This is the royal lineage of Judah that has to return, and they don't know who they are because they converted to Catholicism, and they've been Catholic converts all these centuries later. But more and more people like myself are starting to find out. Always had this love for Israel, really couldn't explain it, had this love for the Jews, couldn't explain it. And it's not just my story. This is the story of millions of people. In fact, the Israeli government believes there could be as many as 500 million Jews who are descendants of these conversos who were forced to convert to Catholicism and leave their faith.
So how many generations are you talking here, Lori?
We're talking I can go back 5 generations to my 5th great grandmother. But if you look at what happened with regards to the Jews when they fled Spain, some remember Columbus. Columbus was a Jew. A lot of people don't know that, but Columbus was a Jew, and he left the night that the Inquisition was going to begin, and he sailed. So we're talking, 500 years of history, and more people now are starting to come out and talk about this. Not only did they come to Americas, the Americas, but they went to the Netherlands. The Netherlands embraced them and allowed them to come in and live safely, which I find really interesting. They traveled.
No, excuse me. This is so fascinating. So, by the way, so you're working on a documentary here. Let us know when that is coming out. I don't know where you're on the process. It's a fascinating story. So, I guess the question I would have, given modern times, and these Jews now are starting to look back on their lineage and the Inquisition and all of those things, they now have the freedom to choose, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But it's important. The reason why it's so important for us as Christians, because this is part of the prophecy that has to take place, where Judah and Ephraim, just like what I mentioned earlier, where Judah and Ephraim are going to unite together. This is a fulfillment of the prophecy. The goal of the Messiah, and this is what Jesus came to do, and a lot of us don't really recognize when he said in Luke chapter 4:43 that I come to restore the kingdom back to Israel. That was the whole purpose to which he came. That was his gospel message. And that's in Luke 4:43. But we don't understand what that means until we go and we look at the disciples when Yeshua was getting ready to be carried up into the heavens. And the disciples asked him, they had one final question to ask him. They asked, will you at this time restore the kingdom back to Israel? Because they believed that he was the Messiah. Everything that he had done, they believed. But the one thing that the Messiah had to do was restore all 12 tribes, to restore the nation back to Israel, to restore the kingdom back to Israel, to bring back all 12 tribes. This is one of those tribes. This is the descendants of the tribe of Judah that have to come back as part of prophecy. This is why it's so important.
Wow, fascinating. Absolutely. So where are you in the process?
We are actually in the beginning process of trying to raise money, Perry. Mm-hmm. So we just got a matching grant of $100,000 toward this project. We've had other donors who have reached out to us that want to be a part of it as well. We're hoping to begin production. We'll be flying to Israel in December and starting the whole process of interviews with some of the experts. And so we're really excited about it. We feel like we're involved in helping bring prophecy to fruition.
Wow. All right, go to pjtn.org. That's the website, and support what she's doing. Maybe you can get involved in this project as well. pjtn.org. Lori, that is fascinating. Please keep us posted and let us know how it's going. So thank you. Thank you.
God bless you guys. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Barry.
Say hi to your hubby for me.
Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.